What if I told you that in the 1920s, the richest men in the world, senators, poets, kings, were paying small fortunes to have a living animal cut open so that pieces of it could be sewn directly into their bodies? Not because they were desperate, not because medicine had failed them, but because a French surgeon had convinced them, with logic that sounded perfectly reasonable at the time, that this was the key to eternal life. And here's the part that should unsettle you even more. Some of them said it worked. They reported feeling 20 years younger. They said their memory sharpened. Their bodies felt alive in ways they'd forgotten. And the press, the mainstream, respectable press of the era, printed every word. His name was Dr. Serge Abrahamovich Voronov. And his story is not just about one man's obsession with immortality. It's about how an entire civilization can convince itself that something monstrous is miraculous. It's about the gap between confidence and truth. And it's about a consequence so horrifying, so slow-moving, so massive, that we're still living inside it today. This is the story of the man who sowed human seeds. Voronov was born in 1866 in Shiraivo, a small village in western Russia, the 14th child in a Jewish family. From his earliest years, he was described as relentlessly curious, the kind of boy who needed to understand how things worked, not just accept that they did. As a teenager, he emigrated to France. He was bright, ambitious, and possessed of something rarer than intelligence. He was convincing. People believed him. In Paris, he studied medicine and fell under the influence of Alexis Carrel, one of the most decorated scientists of the early 20th century. Carrel would go on to win the Nobel Prize in 1912 for his groundbreaking work on suturing blood vessels, work that made organ transplantation conceivable for the first time in human history. Voronov absorbed everything. Voronov was born in 1866 in Shiraiv, a small village in western Russia, the 14th child in a Jewish family. From his earliest years, he was described as relentlessly curious, the kind of boy who needed to understand how things worked, not just accept that they did. As a teenager, he emigrated to France. He was bright, ambitious, and possessed of something rarer than intelligence. He was convincing. People believed him. In Paris, he studied medicine and fell under the influence of Alexis Carrel, one of the most decorated scientists of the early 20th century. Carrel would go on to win the Nobel Prize in 1912 for his groundbreaking work on suturing blood vessels, work that made organ transplantation conceivable for the first time in human history. Voronov absorbed everything, but the chapter that truly shaped him came not in Paris but in Cairo. From 1896 to 1910, Voronov served as a personal physician to Abbas II, the Khedive of Egypt, essentially the ruler's private doctor, with access to the royal court and its innermost circles. And it was in Egypt that Voronov saw something that burrowed into him and would not let go. He observed the eunuchs, men who had been castrated in service to the court. They were, he noted, aged beyond their years. Their skin hung loose. Their muscles had wasted. Their energy was low. Their minds, some would say, had dimmed. Compared to intact men of the same age, eunuchs appeared to have been robbed of something fundamental. Voronov drew a line. The glands that had been removed were the source of vitality itself, not just of reproduction, but of life force, of the animating energy that separates a vigorous man from a diminished one. He was not entirely wrong. The hormones produced by the testes, particularly testosterone, do play a significant role in muscle mass, energy, cognition, and overall health. His observation was medically valid. What he did with it was not. When he returned to France, Voronov was carrying a mission: find a way to restore what age and biology take away. Find a way to put the glands back, before he turned to humans, Voronov spent years experimenting on animals. He grafted testicular tissue from young rams onto aging sheep and observed that the recipients seemed to grow more wool, gain more weight, and appear more energetic. He published his findings. He presented at conferences. He was taken seriously. In a 1919 paper, he described grafting tissue between dogs with what he called highly promising results. He was building a case piece by piece, published study by published study that would allow him to cross the threshold into human surgery with the blessing, or at least the silence of the medical establishment. His logic was also shaped by the transplant science of the era. At the time, the concept of immune rejection, the body's fundamental tendency to attack and destroy foreign tissue, was only dimly understood. The immunological revolution was still decades away. Surgeons of the 1910s genuinely believed that with enough skill, foreign tissue could be integrated into a host body and take root. Voronov believed this completely. He believed that slicing a chimpanzee's testicular gland into thin strips and sewing it alongside a human's own gland would allow the tissue to bond vasculars, grow its own blood vessels, and begin to function as though it had always been there. He was wrong, but the tragedy is that he had every reason available to him in 1920 to believe he was right. Hey, before we get into what happened next, real quick, if you're finding this story as wild as I do, hit that subscribe button right now. Every week we go this deep into stories that most history books skip entirely. And smash the notification bell so you don't miss what's coming up next. Because I promise you, the next video is just as unhinged as this one. Now, back to the monkey glands. In June of 1920, Dr. Serge Voronov performed the first human xenograft on record. His patient was an aging Frenchman. The procedure: Voronov harvested thin slices from the testicular tissue of a chimpanzee and sutured them directly into the man's scrotum, alongside his own glands. The patient walked out of the clinic reporting that he felt better within weeks, and that was all it took to open the floodgates. Within 2 years, Voronov's waiting list stretched across Europe. He performed the surgery at his private clinic in Paris and at surgical theaters across France, Italy, and North Africa. His fee was enormous by the standards of the day, equivalent to tens of thousands of dollars in modern money, and still men paid it without hesitation. 1,000 plus procedures performed globally, around $5,000 cost per surgery. 1920s, $72 acres. Private ape farm, Italian Riviera, 12 plus countries where procedures spread. Demand outpaced supply. There weren't enough chimpanzees. So Voronov did what any confident visionary of the Belle Epoque would do. He bought a castle on the Italian Riviera and built a private primate breeding farm on its grounds. Dozens of chimpanzees and baboons, kept alive specifically to supply his operating tables. The press was ecstatic. Newspapers called him the Wizard of Paris. Feature articles proclaimed that old age itself was on the retreat. The poet E. A. Cummings referenced the procedure. The composer Noel Coward reportedly joked about it at dinner parties. Scientists at the Third International Congress of Surgery in 1923 gave him a standing ovation. Other surgeons, sensing gold, piled in. In the United States, doctors began grafting goat and sheep glands, not even chimpanzee tissue, offering budget versions of Voronov's procedure to men who couldn't afford the journey to Paris. In Argentina, in Brazil, in India, in Egypt, local surgeons advertised monkey gland rejuvenation in newspapers. It was a global industry, built on a single man's conviction. I have given old men back the fire of their youth. I have restored to them the will to live, the strength to act, and the joy of being alive. Voronov, 1925. He believed every word of it. That's what makes this so much more interesting than a simple con. He wasn't deceiving his patients, he was deceiving himself along with them. It was a global industry built on a single man's conviction. I have given old men back the fire of their youth. I have restored to them the will to live, the strength to act, and the joy of being alive. Voronov, 1925. He believed every word of it. That's what makes this so much more interesting than a simple con. He wasn't deceiving his patients, he was deceiving himself along with them. Why everyone believed it, to understand why 1,000 educated, wealthy, intelligent men agreed to have ape tissue sewn into their bodies. You have to understand what it felt like to age in the 1920s. There were no statins, no joint replacements, no hormone replacement therapy, no antidepressants. When your body started to fail you, and it failed fast in those days, medicine had almost nothing to offer. Aging was a one-way door and it opened early. Voronov offered a different story. And crucially, his patients experienced what felt like real improvement, because they did. The placebo effect, operating at full intensity on men who desperately wanted to believe, is physiologically measurable. Blood pressure drops, cortisol falls, testosterone, the real thing produced by the patient's own body, can actually tick upward in response to the psychological experience of receiving treatment. And the men who underwent this surgery were not reporting results in a vacuum. They were reporting them to other men who had paid for the same surgery. There was enormous social pressure to say it had worked. To say otherwise was to admit you had wasted a fortune on a fraud. So the testimonials multiplied, and with them the belief, and with the belief the surgeries, round and round. There was also a scientific reason the grafts seemed viable in early follow-up. The implanted tissue didn't immediately die. It would survive for weeks or even months before the immune system fully broke it down, during which time trace hormonal activity might have been measurable. The window of apparent success was real enough to sustain the illusion. Quick pause. We're about to get into the part of this story that nobody talks about. The part that researchers are still arguing about today. The part that connects Voronov's operating table to one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is a really good time. And hit that notification bell, because the next video picks up a thread that connects directly to what you're about to hear. I'll see you on the other side of this. Let's go. Here is where the story stops being about one man's ego and starts being about all of us. To understand what may have happened as a result of Voronov's surgeries, you need to understand one concept: zoonotic transmission. It's the process by which a virus or pathogen jumps from an animal host into a human one. It's how SARS emerged, how Ebola spreads, how influenza mutates into new forms that devastate human populations. When a virus lives inside an animal, say, a chimpanzee, it has evolved to function inside that specific biology. It may not harm the animal at all, but introduce that virus to a human body, especially through an open wound, especially with primate tissue sewn directly into human tissue with blood contact on both sides, and the conditions for a catastrophic cross-species jump are essentially ideal. Now, chimpanzees carry a virus called SIV, Simian Immunodeficiency Virus. It does not harm them. It lives quietly in their immune cells, replicating slowly, causing nothing. They are natural hosts. It is their virus. HIV, the virus that causes AIDS, is the human form of SIV. This is not a theory. This is established virology. HIV-1, the strain responsible for the global AIDS pandemic, originated from a cross-species transmission of SIV from chimpanzees to humans. The question is not whether it happened. The question is when and how many times. Phylogenetic analysis, the technique of tracing a virus's evolutionary tree backwards through its mutations, places the most likely origin of HIV, one group M, the pandemic strain, somewhere between 1910 and 1930, in West Central Africa, possibly in or around what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo. In 1999, Dr. Christiane Gronberg and colleagues published a paper in the journal Medical Hypotheses proposing that Voronov surgeries and the wave of similar procedures performed across Africa and Europe in that era may have been one of the pathways through which SIV crossed into humans. The argument is not that Voronov alone caused HIV. The mainstream scientific position attributes the original cross-species jump to hunters or butchers handling chimpanzee carcasses in Central Africa, a process that may have happened multiple times. But the hypothesis is this: once SIV had crossed into a human or two through bushmeat exposure, Voronov's surgical network, with its thousands of procedures using live primate tissue performed across multiple continents, may have amplified transmission, spread the virus across geographies it would never otherwise have reached, and accelerated what would have otherwise been a slow, contained regional infection into something that could seed a global pandemic. Think about what his operating theater looked like. Men flying in from London, Buenos Aires, New York, Cairo, having primate tissue placed inside their bodies, then flying home, returning to their wives, their lovers, their circles, with something new inside them that science would not even have a name for until 1983. The hypothesis remains contested. Many virologists believe the evidence points elsewhere, that the pandemic strain emerged from repeated hunting-related exposures in Central Africa and spread through colonial-era medical programs using unsterilized needles. Voronov's role, if any, is speculative. It sits in the peer-reviewed literature, and it sits there because the mechanism is biologically coherent, the timing matches, and the geography overlaps. We cannot rule it out. That is the sentence that should keep you up at night. Even without the viral question, Voronov's world was already crumbling by the 1930s. Better designed clinical studies were emerging. Studies with control groups, with follow-up periods longer than a few months, with measurable biological endpoints rather than patient self-reports, and they found nothing. No sustained hormonal benefit, no measurable increase in vitality, no physiological change that couldn't be explained by placebo. The reason scientists now understood was immunological rejection. The human immune system is extraordinarily good at recognizing foreign tissue. Within weeks to months, the grafted chimpanzee material was identified, attacked, and destroyed. Completely absorbed, gone, as if it had never been there. The monkey glands had dissolved, and with them, 60 years of Voronov's career. By 1940, his name was a punchline in medical journals. Colleagues who had praised him now avoided mention of their association. The waiting lists at his Paris clinic shrank to nothing. His Italian primate farm, once a symbol of boundless ambition, was shuttered. He spent his final years living in Switzerland, then in Lausanne, increasingly isolated, writing memoirs that few read, giving interviews to journalists who came looking for a curiosity rather than a visionary. He died on the 3rd of September 1951. At the age of 85, the obituaries were brief. My work was ahead of its time. The world is not yet ready to understand what I have done. Voronov, in one of his last interviews, he may have been right about the first sentence. He was certainly wrong about the second. We understand exactly what he did. We just don't like the understanding. There are 3 ways to read Serge Voronov. The first, he was a fraud, a showman who wrapped superstition in surgical gowns and exploited the one fear richer than poverty, the fear of death. And there is truth in this reading, the lack of any control group in his early work, his resistance to critique, his willingness to charge small fortunes for procedures he could not scientifically justify. The second, he was a genuine scientist, operating at the frontier of knowledge, who drew reasonable conclusions from the evidence available to him and was simply wrong, the way most frontier scientists eventually are. Germ theory was once fringe. Continental drift was once a laughingstock. The history of medicine is the history of people who were wrong in important ways before they were right. Voronov ran ahead of immunology, ahead of endocrinology, ahead of virology, not out of malice, but out of impatience. The third reading is the one we struggled to hold. That a man's sincere, brilliant, reckless quest to defeat death may have threaded something into the human bloodstream that death itself would spend the rest of the century collecting on. That and trying to extend human life, he may have, in some way we will never fully calculate, shortened millions of them. We still have men like Voronov. They have better tools now, cleaner labs, longer acronyms, but the same certainty. The same impatience with caution, the same conviction that the breakthrough, the real breakthrough, the one that changes everything, is just one more incision away. I'm not saying they're wrong. History suggests most of them are. But history also suggests that sometimes the price of being magnificently, confidently, brilliantly wrong is paid by people who never knew your name. Think about that. If this video made you think or made you uncomfortable, that's exactly what it was supposed to do. Subscribe if you haven't already, drop a like if this was worth 20 minutes of your life, and hit the notification bell because our next video is already in the works, and it goes somewhere just as dark, just as strange, and just as true as this one. Leave me a comment. Do you think Voronov was a visionary, a fraud, or something the English language doesn't have a word for yet? I read every single one. I'll see you next time.